or seize control of mosques and charitable organizations and community organizations, and through those organizations to dominate the American Muslim community, and then wield the American Muslim community as a force for power. And so we're talking about that threat and how we can address it, American Muslims, non-Muslims together. And I'm really excited about our panelists. Joining me today is Dalia al-Aqidi. She is a journalist and commentator who spent over 3 decades reporting on from the capital cities of the Middle East and from Washington, D.C. She's written, produced, and hosted presentations on television and radio in both English and Arabic. She's Muslim, born in Baghdad, Iraq, and came to the United States as a refugee in 1993, gaining worldwide recognition for her work as an anchor at Al-Hurra, the US-based public Arabic language satellite television. And most importantly, perhaps she's currently running for Congress as a Republican in Minnesota District 5. Also joining us is Dr. Zhudi Jasser. He's the founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy and a co-founder of the Muslim Reform Movement. He's also the author of the bestseller, A Battle for the Soul of Islam, an American Muslim's Patriot's Fight to Save His Faith. He's a former commissioner and vice chair of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom and a host of Reform This on the Blaze Radio Network. He was also has briefed members of the House and Senate on the threat of political Islam for some time now. So we will start with Dalia. If you'll tell us a little bit about what you have observed coming to the United States, how Islamists interact with the American Muslim community, and sort of how you view the problem.
First of all, thank you, Kyle, for having me. Of course, as you said, I'm running in Minnesota's 5th district against Ilhan Omar, and we will talk about why, and we'll talk about the danger of the Muslim Brotherhood. Being a Muslim has nothing at all to do with my own political identity, nothing at all. I come from a Muslim background in Iraq, but I'm fiercely secular. Not only do I refuse to follow Islamic religious law or Sharia, but I believe it has no place in our country. There are some people who feel differently, of course, here and elsewhere. I encountered them when I was working in the Middle East and Europe as a journalist for 3 decades. And I fought them when I was working there. And now I decided to fight them here in my country. They go by different names in different places, but they are all the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is the most important Islamist movement in the world right now. It was founded, as you said, in 1928 as a direct response to the fall of the Ottoman Caliphate. Since that time, their members have been concerned with restoring the Islam of the Caliphate on a very basic level. That means government by Islamic law, or the Sharia law as we all know it. The context these people were operating, it's very important. Everyone in the East was looking at a competing system of government fighting each other in the West. You had liberal democracies, but you also had fascism and communism. Intellectuals in the Islamic world wanted to borrow from each system and put it all together through an Islamic lens. They understood that the Ottoman Empire was not successful. The Ottomans did not take Islam or Sharia for the base of governor. So the systems of governments they came up with would be more centered on Islamic law. They also stole the elements of fascism and communism as examples for how to build a modern state. Big, imposing bureaucracies that keep their people in line through fear. They also looked at the Soviet Union and saw how it was possible to have an ideology or ideological state where political enemies were punished in the service of that ideology. We call these people Islamists, not Muslims. While the Brotherhood was founded and branched off from Egypt, similar movements started elsewhere in the Muslim world with the same goals. For example, for the first decades of its existence, Islamists looked to change governments in the Middle East. They were involved in coups, assassinations, getting themselves banned in many countries because of their success, because that's how they started. So they couldn't change any government, they couldn't do anything, but they succeeded in getting banned from the region. But they were only successful at this point. Egypt expelled them or imprisoned them under Jamal Abdel Nasser. Now Egypt designated the Muslim Brotherhood, and UAE designated that group as a terrorist group. Mass immigration brought millions of Muslims from the Middle East into countries in the West like the United States and Europe. Slowly, communities of Muslims started to build institutions. Unfortunately, the people who were most interested in building these institutions were associated with the Muslim Brotherhood. They created hundreds of organizations of every kind. They knew the new immigrants in a new country like to be reminded by their culture and their country. People don't want to lose when they immigrate. People don't want to lose their culture, or they want to keep the link with their parents. There is a natural desire for families to want to involve themselves and their kids in cultural events and clubs, as we all see around the United States. If you were a typical Muslim who wasn't an Islamist, or you didn't want to be exposed to Muslim Brotherhood propaganda, you had two choices. You could go to your local ISNA or ICNA conventions and be around other Muslims like CARE and others for a weekend, and then, or you don't do this and you stay at home. With this immigration into the West came the next big shift in Islamist thinking in the 1960s and after. The Brotherhood began to concentrate on what it called Muslim minority affairs, how to keep American Muslims separated from the communities, and how to prevent them from joining the common American's culture. In areas where the Sharia would conflict with the Constitution or the laws, like in America, the Brotherhood wanted American Muslims to prefer Sharia than the Constitution or than the American law or any law. That was their mission here in the United States and still is. Another shift in Islamist thinking came even more recently, and people like, we all know, like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, are very much a part of that. And we know that, and you know that, Kyle, that CARE has been grooming Islamists around the United States of America for November 2020. And that would be extremely dangerous because we don't know unless we go and look and search or listen to you guys to tell us who these people are. They use them to keep the Muslim community separate from the rest of America. They are trying to do this with African Americans and every possible group. They want to keep these communities separate by making these communities despises America, its history, and despises the form of government. That is the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's quite clear and we know it. And I truly believe that we, not only Muslims or secular Muslims, we all Americans have to fight it because it's dangerous. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. And this is a great time, I think, to bring in Dr. Jasser. Zhudi, you have been involved in this fight now for some time. how do you see the fight between Islamists and the American Muslim community shaping up right now? And how do you approach this problem, and what do you think we can do about it?
Well, Kyle, thanks for having me, and I want to thank the Center for Security Policy for convening this. And as our country struggles with the fight against this virus, we realize that our enemies do not sleep, and we need to continue to fight these battles on every front, regardless of how overwhelmed we are on the other fronts. And it's nice to be with Dalia. Dalia, thank you for all the work that you've done over the years, and it's nice to share this platform with you. Yeah, we've come a long way since 9/11. We are almost 19 years. And on the one hand, if you want to look at the cup half empty, we've not made as much progress as I would have ever thought we would have. But on the other hand, I think we've had a lot of teaching moments that I think has evolved. I think the term political Islamism has become the focus of strategies, and it's no longer simply about a symptom or a technique such as terrorism. And the focus of this panel, which is Sharia, is really the fact that Sharia is an instrument. It's one of the main instruments by which the Islamists interweave control of our communities. And I have to tell you, if you look at where we are today, some people try to dismiss Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar as being aberrations or sort of weird coincidences, if you will, because of social media and the squad, as they're called, but they're not. Everybody watching this that studies politics, that studies sort of the red-green alliance globally between the far left communist socialists, as Dalia was mentioning, and the Islamists, should realize that these guys have been training for a while. They're the farm team of Islamists. It is not an aberration. This is who's leading our community. And I say our community loosely. I'm talking about Muslim organizations that are identity Muslim organizations in America. So it is not a coincidence. Ilhan Omar's anti-Americanism, her hate, which I take very personally for our American military, that she has called, I served in Somalia, and she tweeted 2 years ago that we were the terrorists in Somalia. So I take this very personally as an American former naval officer. And I will tell you that this is the sentiment that comes out of political Islamic movements and groups. It is the sentiment bred from imams and mosques that were saying that American soldiers were committing war crimes in Iraq and elsewhere, and continues to be part of the radicalization process. So just to get you up to speed as to where we are, we formed our American Islamic Forum for Democracy back in 2003. We did it under the mission not to fight terrorism, which again is a symptom, but to really fight the idea of political Islam, being that our mission is to separate mosque and state and to protect the US Constitution, freedom, and liberty. That has evolved into programs that have included our Muslim Liberty Project, which engages youth that agree with those principles, our public engagement project that does work like this, engages media and academics, universities, interfaith work. And last is our Muslim Reform Movement that developed a 2-page declaration that we think should become part of the mainstay of trying to delineate who are the Islamists, who are those that believe in Sharia supremacism versus those that are really just Americans that happen to be Muslim. As we say, not Muslims that demand to be American, which is really what the Islamists are all about. So if you look at the last 19 years and more, I mean, the Islamist movement had a 50-year, if not more, head start on the rest of us Muslims. That head start being the late 60s when the Saudis and others funded the Muslim Student Association and then sprouted the Islamic Society of North America. And that sort of created this Islamist lobby. And their mission included not only sprouting these organizations, but keeping Muslim communities that immigrated wanting to be free, immigrated here and keeping them separate, not only in communities, but consciously, sort of a separatist mindset in that this is not our land, not our country, not our flag, and making them feel that they didn't belong. So our American Islamic Forum teaches our youth that there's nothing more human, more preferable to live in than in a country that's a secular liberal democracy that is not an Islamic flag, that actively rejects an Islamic state, and that we teach our youth and others that it can be a very, not only very Muslim, but very obviously very American to reject theocracy, and that Americans can have this battle that right now, normative Islam is really dominated by an establishment. And I think this is what the Trump era has been a significant gift to our work, which is as Americans struggle for understanding the swamp versus the establishment versus the rest of America, we in the Muslim community, as Dalia was talking about, we've been fighting against the establishment for centuries, which is the Islamic, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, that hegemony between Iran and Qatar and the Islamists that up until 2 years ago included Saudi Arabia and others. Now there's been some internecine battles we can talk about later if you want. But at the end of the day, we're now beginning to educate Americans, and Americans are realizing that the Ilhan Omars of the world aren't coming out of thin air. They're coming out of a farm team that's been part of a massive global lobby that includes Islamist interests, in which they will on every platform, be it academic platform, be it media platform, use things like victimization, make being Muslim not into an idea anymore, but into a identity, as if it's a racial skin color issue, and rather than actually being an ideology that has diversity. And diversity no longer means to them simply ideological diversity, and it only means racial diversity. And they use Muslims as being part of that lack of diversity, as being a monolithic group. So we've been fighting that. Our Muslim reform movement is about bringing folks to the table. We actually aren't trying to suppress their freedom of speech, as they say we are. We're actually trying to have a seat at the table to expose Americans to the fact that there are many other Muslims. There are Muslims that are not only pro-American, but reject their Islamism. And I hope we can talk today on this panel about how easy it is. I mean, the Dalias of the world and the rest of us, it takes us 5 minutes to know an Islamist when you start talking to them.
Oh,
and it's easy to figure it out. Most Americans sort of get bewildered because they're trying to get their head around, how do we know who the Islamists are? And they're a political party. And the answer I give is, you know, it's like a capitalist who can figure out in 5 minutes who the socialists or the communists are, because you just know who the free market people are. And it's the same way with the theocrats in our faith. So, you know, I think people need to start to understand sort of the synergy between the AOCs and Ilhan Omars, just like there's a synergy with the red-green axis globally. And I hope we can talk about that today, because as we awaken to that, we need to start looking at solutions. And one of our new projects is looking at future Muslim leaders of America. We thought, you know, Kyle, I will tell you, admittedly, I thought 10 years ago that I would come to 2020 and be able to tell you about having conventions of 20, 40,000 Muslims who agreed with us. And we would have a massive movement that was anti-Islamist, sort of like what we're seeing in Tunisia now and elsewhere. But in Tunisia and in other countries that had been fighting Islamists after some of the dictators went away, they had a huge motivation to push back against fascism and against Islamism. In the United States, Muslims have gotten such a pass and been so coddled, it's been hard to light a fire under their feet. So it's been very hard for us that are trying to get the anti-Islamist movement going, to get that populist part of our movement. So right now, we're focusing more on creating more of the Dalia al-Aqidis of the world, the Ezra Nomanis and the Rahil Razas and others, so that we can begin to show folks that if we have 20, 30 anti-Islamist Muslim pundits that can begin to show that we are a diverse community, then later we will be able to begin to build organizations that can create a new identity for Muslims that's separate from the mosque, separate from the Islamist movements, and begin to educate Americans that being Muslim is not always synonymous with being Islamist.
I think that's we should add also the Zhudi Jassers as well to that list.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a couple of questions about what the interaction between Islamists and the Muslim American community looks like, and then get into a little bit about how, because you both referenced it, and I think it's important, how the left plays a role in impacting this. So one of the questions that I had, first up, you mentioned, Zhudi, the ability to recognize Islamists when you see them. How do Islamists represent themselves in order to get political support? How do we identify them when they're seeking positions of power or they're running for office?
In a sneaky way.
Dalia, did you want to go ahead, or do you want me to
No,
start
no,
with that?
no. I
We'll
just said in a
go first
sneaky
with
way.
Zhudi, and
Oh.
then Dalia, you can answer as well.
Okay. So it's interesting. They won't come out and say we're an Islamist because they realize that in America, there's no religious parties, particularly. In London, the Muslim Brotherhood did set up shop. So where they can, where there is no prohibition or cultural obstacle from forming a religious party, they will. It's actually funny today, when Bernie Sanders pulled out, some of the Islamists that care here in Arizona have been talking about forming a new party because they're so upset that their man pulled out of the race. But, you know, having said that, you know, it's interesting. In the Middle East, obviously, they form a party, whether it's Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Salafi parties or otherwise. But in the West, I think the way you can tell them is they talk about Muslims in a way that's collectivist, that somehow we all think alike. So that's one way to quickly tell. Secondly, they will feel that the Islamic centers, the places of worship, are places for them to advance their political agenda. So they use our religious facilities for collective political interests and their lobbying. Third, they focus on shame and dishonor. So, for example, when they criticize folks like me or Dalia, they won't target our message. They'll target us as individuals. So they will often target the messenger as being a traitor. That I've had sermons said against me that we've translated and put on the web at my mosque in Scottsdale, that because I was critical of Hamas, they said that somehow I was an agent of the Zionists and I was working with the enemies of Islam. They quoted excerpts from the Quran saying that because of my activities, that I somehow represented those in the Quran that were traitors to the faith and pretended to be Muslim, and were not really Muslim, but were traitors inside our community. So they use that us versus them mentality to do away with their strongest opposition. Third, they use intimidation. So you'll find them constantly intimidating folks. They focus on America and Israel and the West in a very bigoted, anti-Western, anti-Semitic way. They are almost uniformly anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, which is why our organization uses that as a litmus test to pick up on Islamists, is whether they support the state of Israel or not. They will often be swimming in the same pool as the BDS movements and other pro-Palestinian type anti-Semitic movements. They express themselves in a way that is related to, I think, an identity movement that's very clear. And they also wrap themselves in victimization. Yeah. And I think you constantly will see that they're complaining about this act of bigotry, that act of bigotry. So their entire platform is somehow based in how their rights have been opposed versus actually looking at the top things that Americans care about, which is healthcare, taxation, national defense, and other things. Their agenda is on a completely different agenda, which is part of what the Islamist parties typically have.
And Dalia, what would you say? You've been all over the world, interacted with all kinds of Islamists, both here in the United States and abroad. How do you see or identify Islamists?
Sorry, let me just. I agree with what Zhudi said. Plus, thinking that Rashida Tlaib or Ilhan Omar are the devout Muslims, they are not. And that's why one of the reasons the Somali community here are very frustrated with her and because of her personal life, which I'm not willing to go into it. But they are not a devout Muslim. They're totally different. And I keep saying that Islamists, and like what Zhudi said, it's about a political movement. It has nothing to do with religion. A person like me who is very secular, I keep my faith at home. It's nobody's business if I pray, if I don't. This is my life. But I don't push my beliefs on everybody. And the only reason why I use, I'm a Muslim and former refugee in my campaign, that's because I am, with my background, I am immune from her brand or identity politics. So I could push for discussions for matters that issues that matters to our district, even our country. Islamists in our country would have nothing whatsoever if not for the far left. They are exactly as powerful in their communities and in the wider American political environment as the left allows them to do so. So they're nothing without the left. Islamists can count on the left in media to constantly tell Muslims that America is unjust, horrible, it's an evil country. The Islamist coming from mainstream media is overwhelming. And the propaganda is coming from the mainstream that we all see on a daily basis. So if you're a Muslim and you're in America, you have to feel you're a victim and you're not welcomed here and you have to fight. That's what they teach them from the day they arrive here.
I think that was really well said, and particularly the point about the role of the left in, they want to treat everyone, as you said, Dr. Jasser, collectivistly. And so the left provides Islamists an opportunity to be the representatives of the Muslim community for political purposes. And unfortunately, we see this is beginning, or I should say has been for a while, played a role with the government in terms of assigning funding and giving aid to Islamist groups. How does the way the US government interacts with Islamist groups, how does that make your job as a reformer more difficult?
Yeah, it makes it very difficult. The problem is that when the government looks at American Muslims through a very myopic lens of simply saying, well, it's only the 3 to 4 million Muslims in America that we should care about on this issue, so therefore let's make sure their influencers within their community are happy, so they make the Islamist happy, and which is who's running our community. But they ignore the fact that a quarter of the world's population is Muslim, and the Ilhan Omars of the world have a huge influence on what happens in Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Somalia and elsewhere because of the OIC, and because you saw Ilhan Omar's relationship with Erdogan in Turkey picked up quickly because a lot of what happens in America then guides what happens elsewhere. So the impact on who the government works with here domestically has huge impact on our policy and huge impact on foreign countries that are not our friends, even though they might be in NATO, but they're not our friends when it comes to a lot of the interests of Americans. So from a tribal sense, this is why constantly in the Middle East, before the Arab awakening in 2011, the Islamists had constantly been favored over other groups because it was a tribalism. So not only when the dictatorships in the Middle East helped the Islamists, it would have increase in their influence. But when the American government did the same thing, I can tell you that one of the toughest meetings I had when I was with the U.S. Commission on Religious Freedom was when we were in Egypt in 2013. We visited with the Brotherhood leadership, and Ann Patterson was our ambassador to Egypt. And she basically shook her finger at me and said, who are you to tell us not to work with the Brotherhood because they were elected democratically? And I said, well, ma'am, Hamas was elected democratically, and they're still on our terrorist list because they are a bunch of terrorists. So the Muslim Brotherhood has ideology that's incompatible with our values, and they're a terrorist group. So the bottom line is they think that somehow because of various reasons that these groups should become the anointed leaders of our community. And thus what happens in the mosques here in Scottsdale, Arizona, in Dallas, Texas, in New York City, when Siraj Wahaj in Brooklyn is an imam who ends up raising tons of money for care, he's able to dismiss the things I say, even though I try to expose the fact that not only did his son end up running a terrorist camp in New Mexico, but he has on multiple occasions said things that are horrifically anti-Semitic, anti-American, that are and I've tried the media, the government don't hear it, and they want to fund his causes because it's the lowest hanging fruit. It's going to basically check off the box that they've helped Muslims, when in fact, what it's doing is actually empowering our enemies abroad and also making them continue to have a stranglehold on our community. Because even the Muslims that support us in the back of the mosque will say, well, listen, Zhudi, these are the people that our congressman is talking to. These are the people that CNN's talking to. So therefore, we're going to talk to them because they have access and you don't have
Right,
any
it legitimates
access.
them.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this is the problem.
Dalia, a question for you from our audience. And our audience member asks, how do we influence the media because of the media's attraction to reaching out to Islamists? It can be very difficult to publish anything against them, and they use their clouts and their relationship with the media to silence people. You're a former media person. How do we take on the media as part of this challenge?
I mean, we all know the mainstream media is in bed with the Democrats and the far left. So basically, we have no chance. I personally have announced my campaign in mid-January. I've been all over the news nationally, but from a friendly media, which is the conservative media, but none from the mainstream media, even here in my district. So the reason why, because the Democrats in Congress, they feel that if they do anything against the Muslim Brotherhood, they're going to use or to lose the whole region. Because we all know that the Muslim Brotherhoods have different names in different countries, between Tunisia, Libya, but they're all in one pot. So their argument, and we've been trying, few friends back when I used to live in DC, we've been trying as journalists and as researchers and think tanks to try to push to designate or to add the Muslim Brotherhood on the terrorist list, but we couldn't. And all the arguments that we get from everybody, some of the Republicans, not all, but all the Democrats, that they think that the US is going to lose big allies if they add the Muslim Brotherhood on the terrorist list, while on the contrary, when Obama went to Egypt and gave his shameful speech in Egypt after the Muslim Brotherhood and Morsi took over, it took a long time to for us to go back to Egypt, because the Egyptians were so hurt by us, the Egyptian people and the non-Muslim brotherhoods, and we were parts, and Obama's administration was part of oppressing the Egyptian people. And if we look at now, no matter what, it's not our business to see what's happening there. But at least now we can count on Egypt to be our ally, to stand against Iran, while the far left, even in this crisis, and we're all very busy trying to survive this crisis and trying to lead our communities or our followers through this crisis, Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders and others will keep saying, oh, lift the sanctions on Iran, lift on the mullahs, lift the sanctions. You know what? Even if we do this, the Iranian people will survive, because all the money and everything that comes to the mullah's regime would go to the jihadis, would go to Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, would go to the Shia militias in Iraq, and the people, they don't mind starving their people. So I still don't understand. First of all, I don't understand how could a person like Ilhan Omar to be seated on the Committee of Foreign Affairs. This is very dangerous committee. And she's doing a very, very dangerous, she's playing a very dangerous game with all the countries. I mean, with Israel, which Israel is our biggest ally. And if we need people in the region now, we have Israel, we have United Arab Emirates, we have Egypt, and we have Saudi Arabia to stop the Iranian aggression in the region. And when I say it, it's not only in Iraq, it's in Lebanon as well. And as we see the missiles are going to Israel on a daily basis, and these missiles are paid by former Qasem Soleimani. Hopefully, we'll never see anybody like him again, and
Sure, yeah.
and the mullahs. So it's quite clear that we're facing Iran, and we're facing tyrannies, and we're facing the left and the Democrats that would never allow us to have a decent foreign policy.
I think that's a really good point, because you talked a little bit about how the people in Egypt felt oppressed by a US policy that was pro-Islamist. And I wonder if that view doesn't also carry over to American Muslims who see a US government in domestic affairs that behaves in a way that's pro-Islamist. We had a question, and I wanted to take it because it plays a little bit on what Dr. Jasser said about his situation with his local mosque. And the question is regarding what's taught in local Islamic schools and mosques here in the United States. There's a great deal of concern, obviously, by Americans of all stripes about what gets taught in some of these mosques and schools that are controlled by Islamists. How do reformers, how do moderate Muslims respond to these challenges? And I think importantly, how can we get them to speak up when they're not happy about the content?
That's such a, Kyle, that's such an important question. And it's really central to this work of reform is do we use the old institutions or do we create new ones? Our mission, when we started, I thought, and if you had talked to me in 2007, 2008, if you pull some of my old videos and interviews, you'll see that we thought we could basically start from the back of the mosque and work our way up. And then we realized that those demographics are not going to work in our favor. The vast majority of people that go to mosque regularly, the vast majority of board members of mosques are heavy Islamists. And we need our voices there. I've never been thrown out of a mosque. They certainly have threatened me verbally, but I've never been physically thrown out. So we can't resign that space to them. But to think that somehow we're a majority movement within the mosque is foolhardy. But I will tell you that, so therefore, what do? We create a debate by going to the mosque. We put our declarations on their doors in the Martin Luther-esque type way that we did when we formed our Muslim reform movement, and push them about free speech, push them about women's rights, push them about liberal democracy, and how Sharia is not only anti-humanitarian, but it is incompatible with all the things that we should know to be right as moral, sentient human beings. We need to have that debate, but it's not going to happen inside the mosque. Only 20% of Muslims go to mosque regularly. Those 80% of American Muslims that don't so far are anesthetized and not motivated or activated. So we need to begin to have other pressure points to push this debate, be it at universities, on media. So somewhere we're going to have to wake up media to start, on the left, for example, to really become true to the Me Too movement. It's amazing to me right now. I wrote a piece in which I talked about how many of the courageous women have been testifying to the domestic violence and sexual abuse that some of the imams, the famous imams from Tariq Ramadan to Noiman Khan in Dallas, to an imam that was here at a Scottsdale mosque that had 200 pages of depositions done about his actions against women at the mosque and elsewhere. And I wrote an op-ed about it to the Arizona newspaper, and they wouldn't publish it because they're worried about defamation and other things. And I said, boy, if this was a Catholic church, you would have been all over it. And yet with our, the title of the op-ed was Me Too, except for Muslims. So this is the issue, is that I think reform will happen when we start to engage our community on the same issues that are being engaged in the rest of the American public. And we have the people to have that debate, like Dalia and Ezra and others. The problem is that American influencers, if you will, haven't gone to that next level to where they want to give us the platforms like you have here in order to do that.
Well, they would talk about this issue, but they would invite their experts, which are Islamists, to comment on it, not us.
Yeah, and they would dismiss it. And I do think the next part of the answer to your question, Kyle, is we have a lot of tough work regarding the theology. We can't be in denial that when it comes to the core interpretations of passages that talk about whether it's okay, God forbid, to raise your hand, strike a woman, the cutting of hands for stealing, the vote of a woman that she gets in a court of law, in a Sharia court, all these things that by any and most interpretations are not compatible with the 15th century, let alone 21st century, we need to focus on and address openly and publicly. And that's not going to happen until the rest of America, I think, starts to not use us as an identity group, but rather begin to say that the tough work that needs to be happening in the Middle East, because at the end of the day, as we pull our troops out of Afghanistan and elsewhere, we need to realize that there's no military solution to what's happening in Syria and Afghanistan and elsewhere. It needs a populist movement that is anti-Islamist and anti-fascist, and that the seeds of that movement is going to start here. We need conservatives and folks that are secular liberals like Dalia and others to begin to have platforms like Ilhan Omar so that we can push back against a lot of these movements globally.
On the topic of theology, one of our attendees has asked the question, why do Muslim scholars like at Al-Azhar University in Egypt and elsewhere in the Muslim world not get involved in rebuking or pushing back against Islamist ideology? Anybody wants to take that is
I
welcome
think
to jump
Zhudi
in.
is Dr. Jasser is the one to answer this.
Wow, so that's a great question. So the easy answer is, I remember when my parents fled Syria in the late 60s. I don't remember that, I was born here, but when they fled Syria in the late 60s, I remember my grandfather in the 80s telling me that the Mufti of Damascus, who was a Sunni Mufti, by the way, and the Assad family is a heterodox Alawite movement, which is off of the Shia community, yet that Sunni Imam claimed to be Sufi, claimed to be moderate and all these kind of things because he had a secular general running a dictatorship. But yet he wasn't a reformer, he was a tool of the dictatorship. You couldn't really ask any tough questions in mosques in Syria because it was a lockdown dictatorship that basically everything went the way the Ba'ath Party wanted it to go. So the problem is when you look at the Middle East, the issue is most of the mosques, if it's an Islamic country, Islamist country like Iran, or a Wahhabi-controlled country like Saudi Arabia, if you don't follow sort of the dogma of the government and the judiciary that's running the legal system, you don't have much oxygen in which to disagree and present alternative opinions. And you'll find yourself in jail, you'll find yourself soon beheaded, and otherwise unable to articulate these things. I mean, just ask Raif Badawi's family, ask so many prisoners of conscience in Iran and Egypt and elsewhere. Now, Al-Azhar, I think it's interesting, whose reform are we looking at? They recently said, well, ISIS can't declare jihad, only the government of Egypt can declare jihad. So Al-Azhar said that's such a modern way to look at it. Well, you're never going to reform jihad and destroy that idea if they still think that the Egyptian military, if it ever went to war, would be doing it under the pretext of a jihad declared by the Al-Azhar scholars, even if it's against the Brotherhood. Because as long as you empower an Islamic State to have a military that goes to war with jihad, which is what Erdogan's trying to do and others, you're giving oxygen to this concept of religious-inspired military conquest based in jihad rather than based in a secular national identity. So I think reform is going to have to start in Western free societies that would push back, because there's so much inbreeding going on between Al-Azhar and the Egyptian government and the Brotherhood and every country. Pakistan, why does a secular general that's running the Pakistani government bow his head to the Jamaat Islamiyah, the Islamic Party in Pakistan? Why? Because from a tribal sense, Imran Khan wants to always make sure that the Islamists aren't going to start a revolution and topple him. Same thing in Indonesia. Indonesia is probably one of the most secular governments in the Islamic world, and yet the Islamists are beginning to make inroads into where a Christian mayor was recently put into prison for 2 years because of blasphemy. Why would that happen? Because they have so much influence from a violence perspective, from a threatening intimidation perspective, that the government really didn't want to take them on. And that's why, again, why this has to happen in the West, so that we can begin to build institutions that can start to spread these ideas in otherwise dictatorships.
Question for our panel from a good friend of the center, Karen Lugo. She asks about those who refuse to make a distinction between Islamists and Muslims, and they don't believe in or don't trust the idea that there could be patriotic Muslims. Dalia, you're running for office. You've had this problem yourself sometimes.
Yeah.
How do we overcome that?
Well, I do understand that it's very difficult for the average mosque goer to fight the Sharia law and all the Islamist agendas. Once institutions have been taken over by Islamists or by the left, it's very, very, very hard for them to run away or to leave. My Jewish friends, my Christian friends have been fighting the takeover of their institutions in America by partisan Democrats and leftists. And it's a very tough struggle. It's not only the Islamists. I mean, we see it. People can always leave and stop going to the services or stop going to mosque, or when they see it. But the problem is when it comes with Islamists, because and especially those people who goes to mosque and who even if they disagree with the Muslim Brotherhood and disagree, they don't have the courage to stand against it. As Dr. Jasser said, they use so many things against, especially if it's a family that it's kept the Arabic or the Islamic tradition. They will be boycotted by the community itself. So it's not easy. It's so not easy for these people to come out. And maybe in the future, when we have more open dialogue, we could reach out to these people. And like a funny thing, when I spoke about the Somali community and earlier, and I said that the Somalis are upset with Ilhan Omar because of her marriages and blah blah blah, all the issues. They'd rather vote for me, and I'm a Muslim as well to them. They don't care. You know why? Because I'm not a Somali Muslim, so I can be whatever. And that goes to Egyptians, and that goes to, I believe that an open dialogue could be not between just Muslims, between all of us, between everybody else. I mean, I cannot, or we cannot do this in the Middle East. I mean, 6 years ago, I was on a program in BBC. I was in Beirut. So the argument, we were 4 women, one singer, one, I think, an activist from Algeria or Tunisia, and a Lebanese artist. They were too scared to speak against the Sharia law. And they are in Lebanon, the most open, secular country in the Middle East, after Israel, of course. So I was the only one who kept saying, why do I need to get killed? Why it's okay for me to get killed if I change my religion? It's supposed to be free, a free country. I have to feel I'm a human being, and I have to feel, or not me as a person, or the people in the Middle East, they have to feel that, okay, this didn't work for me, let me try others. But that doesn't go there, because the Sharia Islamiyya has nothing to do with human rights and basically respecting human rights and having Sharia, Islamist Sharia, Muslim Sharia does not go well. Let's keep the religion in mosques, and let's do politics and have decent living. We're in 2020. We care about Corona, not about some Islamist or some care member or Erdogan, for example.
You know, I think oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, there's some really important point on this question about patriotism that I want to make sure people understand. You know, it's interesting. I saw some of the debate that happened in Texas about, I think it was a vice chair of either a county Republican Party or the state. And then I saw one of the, George Bush family come to his defense. And, what happens is a lot of debates rise up on these things, often much later than they should. And it's because some of these candidates, some of these individuals come up through the system and nobody really challenges what they believe about conservatism. Forget Muslim and Islamist, about conservatism, because an Islamist can easily camouflage themselves on the left. You can live with Bernie Sanders as a diehard Islamist and he will never challenge any of your core beliefs. A conservative that truly believes in the Constitution, small government. I mean, look at, let's say this battle now with Corona. I'm seeing our government do things as a doctor that I do not think our government should be doing and shutting down our economy, that I would defend, that make it clear, forget the Islamism stuff. When you say a government should not be telling me that I can't go on a beach because of whatever it is, that obviously shows where I stand. And I think, unfortunately, what's happening is we have lost our way because of the swamp, the establishment, or other things in really defining some of the core priorities of conservatism and patriotism. And what are the things we will defend? The Republican Party used to be the party of immigrants, used to be the party of those who came here to embrace American ideals, because every other country's parties destroyed those ideals. And that's why my family came here. And I think so many other American Muslims will embrace that. And it's not the non-Muslims' fault. It's, I think, the fact that we're being coddled and we're not being treated as adults. And that once somehow we get attacked because of Sharia issues, we then get, it's all about bigotry and the extremes then get polarized, rather than actually dealing with what does this person believe. If he wants to run for vice chairman of a statewide Republican Party, what are his beliefs on healthcare? What does he believe on the Second Amendment and gun rights and all these kind of things? And yet none of that has been vetted. And I think this is going to come hand in hand. We have a program we're working on now called Future Muslim Leaders of America. We're trying to teach in some of the youth that came through our Muslim Liberty Project that now that they're done with law school, done with military education, all the other things, when they're embracing American society, what are some of the things that are core principles of becoming a Republican, becoming a conservative? And I think these things are going to end up being filtering processes where Islamists would never get through that. And I think, unfortunately, some of the folks that aren't enmeshed in these issues find themselves all of a sudden dealing with it when they happen to be close to a Muslim that's in the party and he had never been vetted for it before.
And I think building on that, and Dalia touched on this also, the role of hypocrisy, where Dalia says that she approaches people in her district with what she believes, and that resonates because she doesn't approach it from the Ilhan Omar identity. I am a Muslim woman, whatever.
No.
She approaches, if you approach it from this is who I am and this is what I believe, not this is what group I belong to. And so I do think that you're quite right in that, how do people identify themselves, and are they leading with what their true principles are versus are they leading with, here is the identity by which I wish you would judge me?
Kyle, I identify myself as I am everywhere. If I go to visit or work in my hometown, Iraq or Europe or anywhere, when they ask me anything, I don't say I'm a Muslim. I say I'm an American, period. And that's who I am. And that's what I feel. Yet I find, sadly, some of the right side that has no full understanding of what these are. Probably they've been read like a book or two, and that would, another Muslim, no, she is she's a plot, she is, oh my God, I mean, grow up. seriously grow up. I didn't not come from anywhere. You can call Kyle or you can call Dr. Zhudi and see who I am. But not because like and that's the thing, every Muslim here, some people would think, oh, she's the same as Ilham. Why would we vote for another Muslim? I'm not, go read, go educate yourself, go see who your enemy is and who your friend is, and go see who is American. For me, these people are not Americans, period.
And they don't view themselves that way either. They don't approach things as what is good for America and how am I going to help America. They always approach it as, I am representing the Muslim community.
I'm not representing anybody. I want to represent the people of the 5th district in Minnesota. Yeah. Exactly. Regardless of their faith, their color, their sex, and their political affiliation. When I get elected, I will be representing every single one of them. Not if I see a Muslim, well, I'll give him a special care, or if I see an Israeli, no. I would be a public servant, and I will be.
And I can, a good example, Kyle, is I have some Democratic Muslim friends that would never have written America First about our coronavirus testing numbers, while Ilhan Omar mocked America First by saying that we had the most coronavirus positive tests, which tells you not only is she doing the Chinese propaganda bidding, which, all that data, we know that data is completely wrong. I just use that as an example to tell you that it is so easy to tell that the Islamists will constantly use a mantra that becomes anti-American, when in fact, there are folks in the left that are pro-American, that we might disagree on some of the party platform issues, but when it comes to American patriotism, they are pro-American and will never say stuff like that because they're not Islamists.
That's great. I appreciate both of you coming on with us today. We're all getting used to this new coronavirus format for panels and events, but I think we had a really great event. I know we had quite a number of people. For those of you watching at home, if you missed the start, we will be putting it up on YouTube, so you'll be able to see it there, and also back at our site at securefreedom.com. Dalia, Zhudi, thank you guys so much for coming out today and taking part.
Thank you so much, Kyle.
Appreciate it.
All right, thank you.
All right, all looked great. Congratulations.
Thank you. That was nice. That was good.
Thank you. Great job, Kyle. Great job, Dalia.
Thank you.
You did the
Hey,
greatest
Adam,
job.
it still says live on YouTube if you can kill the stream.
Whoops.